Good evening, sinners and saints! I'm your friendly neighborhood Sin Hound here on Rent-A-Friend Radio, and it is time for the Sin Hound Show! Ow! We're gonna get our nerd on. We're gonna talk about big, important things. We're gonna talk about science! And we're doing it because I love you. And we're gonna rock, and we're gonna roll. So let's get straight into it, babies. Welcome to Creation, Evolution, Chocolate Bars, and Worms, a Sin Hound presentation on Rent-A-Friend Radio. So, last time, I introduced you to young Earth biblical creation. The book of Genesis says that God made the heavens and the earth, oh, there it is, earth, in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. So, this means the heavens and the earth, everything, all the stars and planets, all of time, space, matter, and energy, all of that jazz was made about 6,000 years ago, roughly. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's how in Hebrew you say everything, everything. They don't have the word universe. That's something that the Greeks added later. They're like, hey, we need a word that means everything. So when the Jews say the heavens and the earth, that means everything. Stars, planets, everything. Dinosaurs. Here's something you're like, well, what about the dinosaurs? The dinosaurs lived with humans. On day 6, God created land animals, which is dinosaurs, and created humans, which is us. So, did the dinosaurs live before man? Possibly. Maybe a couple of hours longer than we were here. But we showed up on the same day, the same actual calendar day. That's what Genesis tells us. What about the fossils? Geology is largely a record of the flood event, which only lasted a year. So you've got layers and layers and layers of rock, billions of dead things buried by water and mudslides and all that jazz. Where did it all come from? Most of it came from the flood. One giant catastrophe for one solid year all over the world. So almost all fossils are plants and animals that lived at the same time. Not in the same place, but at the same time. So there it is. There is the rough Genesis, everything. So, let's talk about now how this lines up with science. So am I saying, by saying all of those things, that there is a conflict? Am I admitting that there is a conflict, that it is the Bible versus science? Dun, dun, dun! No, that's not what I'm saying. It's not it at all. It's not what I am saying. There is no conflict between science and the Bible. There is a conflict between atheism and the Bible, or more specifically between atheistic interpretations of science and the Bible. So let's talk about how science works. Science is very, very simple. A lot of people don't fully understand the nature of science. Science is you observe with your senses and with your equipment, you measure things, you test, you record, you write it down, and then you do it all again. What can we see? How exact can we be? Let's do it again. That's science, the scientific method. That's all there is to it, babies. But scientists, and a lot of people think that science and scientists are synonymous. No, science is a method of acquiring knowledge. Scientists are people. They are human beings, men and women, doing science. But scientists are not science any more than dancers are dance. You know what I'm saying? Scientists work like this. They hold to certain beliefs. They have a certain worldview, an established worldview from their upbringing, from their philosophy, from their religion, from their schooling. And then they observe, measure, test, record, and repeat. And then they explain their observations or test results according to their existing beliefs. Because here's the dirty little secret of science, my friends. One cannot know something before you first believe something. And before you can do science, you have to believe things that cannot be proven with science. Bum, bum, bum. Man, can that be true? I know some of you are like, he's talking crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. That's insane. No, listen, this is the philosophy of science. And this is something that a lot of people don't think about and will be like quick to just sort of reject before they think about it. But one cannot know something. You can't know anything before you first believe something. And before you can do any science, you have to believe things that cannot be proven with science. Let me prove that to you here. Here is just a couple of things that fall on this list. I'm going to put myself in the laboratory. Here I am looking in my microscope. Before you can do any science, you have to believe that the external world exists, that the things you are seeing and measuring are real things. But you can't prove that with science. How can you prove that the external world, the world you are observing, how can you prove that it exists with science? You can't. You have to first believe it, and then you can do the science. You also have to believe that the laws of nature are constant and unchanging. We have to believe that the laws of physics and chemistry are the same today as they were yesterday and will be the same tomorrow. This is something that makes perfect sense in the biblical worldview. The Bible tells us that God created the heavens and the earth and that he upholds his creation by his mighty word. Atheism says that there was nothing and then it exploded and then all of the laws of physics and chemistry just kind of evolved by chance. And so we have to have faith that they won't change, even though there's no reason why they're the way they are and there's no reason why they can't change. We just have to believe something that is not only not provable by science, but kind of goes against atheism. You have to believe the truth can be known, your senses are valid, your equipment is accurate, other scientists publish accurate data and observations, etc., etc., etc. There's a lot of things that you have to believe that you cannot prove before you can do the science. Now, this does not mean that any of these things are irrational or should not be believed or anything like that. I am not saying anything against science. I am merely making a proper distinction between what science is and what scientists have to do. That's all I'm doing. It's not that big a deal. I don't know why you guys got to freak out about it all the time. So, that's the philosophy portion. And I know, is it good or bad? Well, neither. I mean, it's just because of being thinking, self-aware beings, we can't avoid having starting assumptions. That as a baby, you are building a worldview. One of the first things babies do is they learn that they can have an effect on the external world. I'm going to go off on this for just a second. Babies are all tiny scientists. You ever watched a baby? They grab a crayon and they realize that the choices they make affect that crayon. And then they discover paper. And this is a whole new world of science for babies. When they put the crayon on the paper and they move it, they learn that it leaves behind a record of where they have chosen to move it. So babies go through what's called the scribble stage because that's what they do. They scribble. They're just like, yeah, look at that. Because the baby is experimenting and seeing cause and effect. They are learning that the choices they make internally on the external world have an effect on the external world. And some of that effect can be a lasting effect that leaves a record of their choices. So that's part of building a worldview. That's part of doing science. And it's part of what every scientist has in their head as they do science. But of course, that's what we call properly basic. That it is self-evident. Where we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Well, what is self-evident? Self-evident is something that is so true and so obviously true that you don't need to prove it. That maybe there's a proof for it, maybe there's not. It doesn't matter. It's so true that the truth itself is its own evidence. So the external world does exist, but you can't prove it with science. But it doesn't mean it's irrational to believe in the external world. The external world is properly basic. There you go. Babies know that. That's why they play with crayons all the time. That's all I'm saying. So it's not good and it's not bad. It just is the way it is. We are building a worldview from the moment we are born. Actually, before we're born. But that's a whole nother conversation. So we can, as scientists, see if new data makes sense within our existing beliefs. Sometimes we need to question our results, our observations, or our equipment. Sometimes we need to question our starting assumptions. You understand what I'm saying? That sometimes when you are seeing something that doesn't fit your worldview, you either have to say, well, maybe my microscope isn't working, or maybe my math was wrong. Or you have to say, well, maybe my starting assumptions, maybe the belief that I had doesn't fit with what actually exists in the world. So that's where you got to think through your worldview. You got to be aware that you have a worldview and then compare it and contrast it to things we can actually know. So here is an example of how your worldview changes your scientific outcome. So, for example, similar features. So if you take a look here, this is the forelimb of a human, a dog, a bird, and a whale. So we all have, I'm going to put myself over the scientist again. Sorry, lady. We all have these bones in our forelimbs. All right, a lot of animals have these bones. It is two bones running from the end of the forelimb to the middle We call this the radius and the ulna. And what these two bones allow us to do with the attached muscles is this. Try that at home. Isn't that fun? Yeah. All of these animals need the ability to do this with their wings or their flippers or their paws or your hands. It's very useful. I mean, try not doing that sometime. You're not going to get as much done. So we need the ability to do that. So that's what those bones allow all these creatures to do, is to rotate the forelimb. So an evolutionist looks at this and says, those are common features. That shows that these all evolved from a common ancestor that had that feature. And they call this homologous features because they believe that the common ancestor of all of these different creatures had the radius and ulna. We, as biblical creationists, say, well, this is an efficient and elegant solution to the problem of how do you get it to do this. It is a great solution that works, and so God used similar structures in a lot of different animals so that they could have the same solution to that problem. How do you fix it? You fix it in the way that works the best. So we all have the same evidence. These bones are the same in all these creatures, no matter what you believe to start with. The difference is, how do you interpret that? What does your worldview say before you look at this evidence? The evolutionist looks at this evidence and says, well, I already believe that these things evolved from a common ancestor, so these common features, these similar features, tell me that they evolved from a common ancestor that had that feature. Biblical creationist looks at this and says, these are a great solution to a problem. It's brilliant engineering, so common design shows a common designer. The evidence is the same, the interpretation changes because of the starting assumption. So, again, a whole lot of people are going to say, well, you guys, you come in here with your religious beliefs, and your beliefs change how you look at things. Everybody's beliefs changes how they look at things. It's just a matter of what is the starting assumption you have. What are you believing to start with when you look at the evidence? So, here's the thing, though. Here's the key, and this is something a lot of evolutionists miss, and a lot of textbooks misrepresent. But the belief that there is a common ancestor, the belief that evolution happened, or the interpretation that this shows common evolutionary heritage, that is not part of the observable data. That's an interpretation. The observable data is those bones. The human, dog, bird, and whale skeletons is the observable data. Using that to come to the conclusion that there is a common ancestor is not part of the observable data. It's an interpretation of the data. And a whole lot of people and a whole lot of textbooks will talk about the interpretation of data as if it is data. They will say things like, well, scientists have observed blah, blah, blah. And then when you actually look into what they've observed, in this case, have scientists observed creatures evolving from common ancestors with common traits? No. They have observed skeletons of things that are alive now and things that we find in the fossil record. That's what they have observed. That is where the science happens. The science is the observation. The interpretation is not an observation. And so, while it is missaid, it is inaccurate to say, well, scientists have observed the evolution of common features through common ancestors. What they've observed are bones. And then they interpret it according to an evolutionary worldview, and they come to the conclusion that, well, therefore, these things are homologous features that mean they evolved from an ancestor. Hope everybody understands the difference there. If not, send me an email, ask me questions. So here's the deal. Here's the point that I'm making. That evolution is not a set of observable facts. It is not science. It is a religious worldview that has a certain set of preconceptions, of beliefs, of faith in things that can't be tested. And then when evolutionists have that religion and they look at the evidence, they force themselves to come to the evolutionary conclusion. So my conclusion is that evolution is a cult, that it doesn't matter what the facts are. It is a set of blinders that if you allow it, will just force you to believe evolution because it's your starting point and it's the only allowed ending point. But you don't have to take my word for it. Here's some that people say, oh, the ding-dang time. To reject evolution is to reject all of science. When people say this to me, I can only think, oh my gosh, you have no idea what science is, and you probably have no idea what evolution is. Because, here's the obvious question. Because people all the time, seriously, I have seen comments left for other people. I have had it directed at me personally. And they're like, you're rejecting evolution, but science allows you to use that computer that you've got. Science has given us medicines and airplanes. And I'm all like, yeah, evolution has not given us computers or airplanes or pink lemonade. So to reject evolution is not to reject the existence of gravity or exoplanets or electrons or quantum mechanics or easy cheese or microwaves. What are you people talking about? So again, it becomes a worldview beyond science and becomes a religion. But again, don't take my word for it. Here is Michael Ruse, professor of philosophy and zoology at the University of something Canada. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. And he says, evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. Evolution is promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity, with meaning and morality. I, Michael says of himself, am an ardent evolutionist and an ex-Christian, but I must admit that in this one complaint, Mr. Gish, who is himself a young Earth creationist, is but one of many to make it. The literalists are absolutely right. Evolution is a religion. This was true of evolution in the beginning, and it is true of evolution still today. Evolution came into being as a kind of secular ideology, an explicit substitute for Christianity. Yeah, buddy. So that is an evolutionist admitting himself what it is I am saying. That evolution is not just a model of science, and it is not absolutely, as people keep telling me over and over, this is just... Now, to be fair, I used to be one of these people who believed this. As a child, going up through in the public schools, I thought, sure, the reason why people believe evolution, Big Bang cosmology, billions of years, billions and billions and billions, is not just because Carl Sagan said so, because science, over hundreds of years, looked at the evidence and just followed the evidence wherever it went, and we came to these conclusions. We discovered it. But it's not true. It's absolutely not true. And here is one of the evolutionists, of many, who is admitting that no, evolution didn't come into being because we followed the evidence where it led. Evolution came into being as a secular ideology, an explicit substitute for Christianity. Now, Charles Darwin did not have as his only intent to replace Christianity, but it was one of his goals, and he was following the footsteps of other men who has their goal to replace history according to Moses and replace it with a secular history that they would invent. But, moving along, Professor Richard Lewontin, a geneticist and self-proclaimed Marxist, because why not? Imagine that, a Marxist as a professor at college? In a college? Can you imagine? How weird. He says of this, and this is a great quote that really explains what it is I'm saying. He says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. Hold on. There you go. Self-proclaimed Marxist. I didn't realize I was covering that up. There you go. Back. So underneath me is the word Marxist. Back to it. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense are the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science, and here by science, obviously, he's meaning evolution, because there's nothing in biblical Christianity or anything in church history that's like, gravity, that's nonsense. Like, we accept gravity. So he's talking about evolution. He's talking about the clash between evolutionism and creationism. We take the side of science, evolution, in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community, by which he means the evolutionary community, for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Materialism is just another way of saying atheism. So hold on, let me unpack this a little bit first. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is a key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. What is the clash between science and the supernatural? Between Christianity and evolution is basically what we're talking about here. It's not a clash between blind faith and things that can't be trusted or things that are unscientific and science. He is admitting, as I will show you, that the clash between evolution and what he calls the supernatural or creation by God, it's not about observable science versus blind faith in something religious. That his dedication to materialism, to atheism, to what he calls science, but I call evolutionism, forces him to accept things that are against common sense. Now, when I get into what evolution is and how it works next time, I will show you that by against common sense, what we mean is evolution forces you to believe that you can add by subtracting. It's literally that insane. I will get to that in a later installment. But he says, why do we do this? Why do we take the side of science, of evolution, despite the fact that it's absurd? Because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism, meaning atheism. He continues, it is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. Now, the phenomenal world is the world you can observe, the world of time, space, matter, and energy. And what he's saying is it's not that the methods of science, it's the scientific method does not force you to accept a material explanation of the natural world. Now, a lot of people are like, well, of course, you can't claim miracles at every turn. And nobody is claiming miracles at every turn. But the problem is science is supposed to determine through observation and experimentation what nature left to nature will do. But once you figure that out, you can also figure out what nature left to nature will not do. This is why the SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, can make some sense. Because once we figure out what kind of radio signals are coming from space, that this is what stars and galaxies sound like when we listen to them, then we can listen for something else. Stars and galaxies don't communicate in ways that are irreducibly complex. They don't send music and words and pictures. They just send dull repeating hums or things that follow explicable natural sequences of, for instance, the rotation of neutron stars. Blip, 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 blip. When we first discovered those things, you'll find those things, those rotating stars, were referred to as LGM and then a number. LGM 161. It's LGM stood for Little Green Men, because we started hearing that beep, beep, beep. We thought someone's trying to contact us. And then we figured out, oh, it's a rotating star of some kind where part of it is giving off more of this type of radiation than another, and it's rotating. And so every time it rotates, it's like a lighthouse. When that light passes you and hits you, it looks like it's flashing, but it's not sending any information. It's just rotating. So because we know what nature left to nature will do, we know what nature left to nature will not do. This is how a paleontologist can determine the difference between something that was created accidentally by nature, by weather, something made by an ancient tribe or civilization. That we can determine the difference between artwork, however simple it is, and scratchings left by a bear. We can say that these designs are what nature left to nature will never do. It must have been the willing creation of a person who intended to make a design, a bit of language, something like that. And it's also how, what do you call it? The crime scene investigation. Your CSI. Your CSI is a bunch of people looking at stuff and saying, all right, we know how people can die of natural causes. We know how natural causes cannot kill people. So, for instance, natural causes usually leave the head attached to the dead person. So if you find a dead body at the scene of the death and the head is missing, you can say, oh, nature left to nature doesn't put the head in a suitcase and send it to the airport. This is foul play, I think. So here's what I'm saying. He is admitting here that the methods and institutions of science don't force you to come up with purely natural explanations of what you observe. Because otherwise, again, every CSI team would just say, it's natural causes. Let's go to lunch. Where's his head? I don't know, but he lost it naturally. Let's go to lunch. But on the contrary, he says, continuing here, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes. That means our pre-existing, our starting assumption. A priori is the starting assumption. Our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Do you see what he is saying? That it doesn't matter how crazy it seems. And it's not a result of science. The scientific method doesn't force us to do this. But he's referring to evolutionists and atheists like himself. He's saying that because we are dedicated to our atheism, and because we are starting off with our dedication to atheism and evolutionism, that we are creating a set of investigation. We create our science so that it has to come to a natural, godless explanation. And why? Because his materialism, his atheism is absolute, and we will not allow a divine foot in the door. So we start off, according to him, this is this professor talking about himself and people like him. They start off with the assumption of atheism that there is no God, that evolution is a fact. And then they create their science so that it has to come to the conclusion that there is no God and that evolution is a fact. And then they do that and they call it science. That's not how science works, kids. That's how a cult works. And this guy's just admitting that evolution is a cult. William B. Provine. Now let me see if I'm covering that up. Professor of Biological Sciences from Cornell University. If I'm not mistaken, Dr. Provine shows up in Ben Stein's movie Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. If you haven't seen that, I recommend it. It's called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, and it is Ben Stein, and it's basically a very entertaining documentary about this very thing, that evolutionists don't allow creationism or any questioning of the evolutionary doctrine, that they treat it like it is their religion, and you are not allowed to question the doctrine of evolution. And then they're like, oh, but science has proven it. No, science hasn't proven it. Science has been forced to accept it as the only acceptable answer. That's why evolutionists can point to evidence, because it's the only thing that's allowed. Anyway, more on that later. Here's what William Provine says of himself, of his beliefs. Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. And I must say that these are basically Darwin's views. There are no gods, no purposeful forces of any kind, no life after death. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no free will for humans either. This, he says, is what modern evolutionary biology tells us. Are these scientific observations? Is this the result of honest, unbiased scientific inquiry? Is any of this about science at all? No, this is his religious worldview, his atheistic religious worldview, but he thinks that his evolutionism is an intellectual foundation for his atheism. Now, the circular logic there is just amazing, that you start off with atheism, and then you ask, well, where did everything come from? And you wind up with something like evolution, because you have to, because there's no designer, there's no creator, and yet there's all of this creation with all this amazing design. So evolution is stuck in the place of the gap that's left when you force God out of the picture. And then there you have it, something that you created because you started off as an atheist, and you have to invent an explanation for the world. So then you take evolution and you put it at the start and you go, okay, now, because evolution's a fact, well, clearly we don't need God to exist, so that proves that atheism is rational. That's what we call circular reasoning, kids. Eugenie Scott, leader of the anti-creationist National Center for Science Education. The National Center for Science Education exists primarily to force evolution into schools and to make sure that anybody who tries to question it gets sued, and so that shuts them up. She says, and this is a great quote, she says, in my opinion, using creation and evolution as topics for critical thinking exercises in primary and secondary schools is virtually guaranteed to confuse students about evolution and may lead them to reject one of the major themes in science. Ha ha ha! Oh, Eugenie, do you see what she's just admitted? If you let them think about it, if you let them compare, what are they going to do? Well, they might reject evolution. If you let them think about it, if you actually let them think about creation and evolution, if you let them do critical thinking about evolution, then it might lead them to reject it. What? Does anybody have a worry about, like, the multiplication table? Is there a math teacher in the universe who would ever look at the multiplication table and say, now, I don't think we should let students think critically about multiplication, because if they do, they might reject it. They might say, hey, none of this is real. Do we do this with gravity, or the War of 1812, or electricity, or conjugation of Spanish verbs? Is there anything else in the world that we pretend is science, where we have this concern that, oh, we can't let people think critically about it, otherwise they might not accept it? No. Ultimately, she's acknowledging that evolution is not science, it's a religion. And like any good cult leader, she's saying you don't question the dogma. You accept the dogma and you don't let them think about it. And finally, for a good laugh, let's look at Richard Dawkins, who is one of the accidentally funniest people in the world. And he has said this: evolution has happened. Oh, sorry. Evolution has been observed. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. Wait, let me start over. And now, one of the accidentally funniest people in the world, Richard Dawkins, the poster boy for evolutionary atheism, who has actually said this out loud. Evolution has been observed. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. Now, somewhere out there, because the internet's a big place, somewhere out there is a skeptic or an evolutionist or an atheist, a very dedicated atheist who's saying, well, what's wrong with that? This guy doesn't understand science. Let me make a metaphor for you. Imagine that you're a police officer and you walk up to the scene of a car accident. There's car parts scattered around. We got some injured people. The ambulance is here. There's a dude standing on the sidewalk and you're like, excuse me, did you observe the collision? And he says, yes, I observed this collision. I can tell you exactly what happened here. And you say, okay, where were you when the collision occurred? Were you standing right here? And he says, oh no, I was at home in my mom's basement playing Minecraft. And you say, okay, but you said you observed this. He's like, oh yeah, I observed the collision. I just didn't observe it while it was happening. I showed up much later after the fact. Actually, I just got here a couple seconds ago. And then I observed it happening by looking at what's here now, and I figured it out. So that's the same thing, right? If you've watched any of those CSI shows, you know that you can do a lot of good deductions based on what's here now about the past, but then there's always that one other bit of information that goes, oh, everything we thought was wrong. Otherwise, the show's not very interesting. Like you solve the case in like 10 minutes, and then you've got 40 minutes to be like, sure solved that case. Remember that case we solved this morning? We really solved it. No, there's always like that other piece of information, or any episode of Poirot with David Suchet, which I recommend because he is the best Poirot. Don't watch the other Poirots. No good. Just David Suchet. There is the conclusion that comes from observing different pieces of evidence and then interpreting the evidence to determine what happened in the past. But it's not the same thing as observing the past. Observing the past is impossible. You can observe the present, and the CSI or the Poirot, they observe what is there in the present to make logical deductions about the past. But another piece of information, another eyewitness, another footprint, another fingerprint can change entirely what your conclusion is. So people like this, people like our dear friend Richard Dawkins, like to say, well, we've observed evolution. We just haven't observed it while it was happening. What's wrong with that? Are you trying to say that no crime has ever been solved? You're trying to say that no murder has ever been accurately solved? Everybody's like false, just making things up? No, I am making necessary distinctions. Necessary distinction. Observing, you have to observe while it is. You can logically deduce from observation things you can't observe. And maybe you're right. It's not that difficult. When I find a footprint, I'm finding the footprint. I'm observing the footprint. But I can logically deduce that there was a foot. Similarly, when I see the tremendous, enormous amount of information in DNA, I can logically assume that a huge pile of information and complex machinery came from a brilliant, intelligent designer. I didn't see him design it, but it's the obvious conclusion, which is why people like Richard Dawkins say, well, we have to keep reminding ourselves that biology is the study of things that look like they're designed with a purpose, but weren't. And he tries to invent this new category of just apparent design. Like, you know how when you see a watch with all of its moving parts, or say a car or the space shuttle or an iPhone, you're like, oh, sure, it looks designed. But that's an illusion. It's just apparent design. It came together accidentally. Like somebody dropped a flip phone into a blender and the pieces reassembled into the iPhone 6. It seems unlikely, but it only had to happen once. All right. So, because the conflict is frequently put between science and religion, or between Christians and science, let's take a look at just the tip of the iceberg that shows that science was created by Christians. The fathers of modern science. The fathers, the creators, the people who started every type of scientific inquiry in the Western world. Chemistry, physics, electricity, astronomy, rockets, anything. Were all Bible-believing Christian men. Now, I'm not saying every one of them was entirely orthodox, but they were all Bible-believing Christian men. And here's just a small sampling of some of those people. So let's run through them real quick. The Venerable Bede was an astronomer. He shows up, like almost 1,000 years before Galilei. And he showed that the tides are caused by the moon and declared that the earth was a globe, not round like a shield, but rather like a ball. Galileo would come up 1,000 years later and explain the tides according to his model. Now, his model got some things right, but his explanation of the tides was wrong. The Venerable Bede 1,000 years earlier was actually right. But the point is, these are Christian men using observation to do science. Because in general, they're saying, look, God is a God of order. The God of the Bible, unlike the gods of any other religions, all other religions have gods that are demons or monsters or kind of like just squabbling men. And even the gods of the Greeks would fight amongst themselves, or the gods of the Romans would fight amongst themselves. There was chaos and disorder, and none of them were eternal. None of them created the universe. But the Bible tells us that the eternal God created the heavens and the earth. Everything that is was his creation. And as God reveals himself, we see, he gives the Jews ceremonial law, civil law, moral law, that order is the way of this God. He's not a God of chaos like all the other religions. And so when we study his creation, it makes sense that a God of law and order would create a universe of law and order. And so in studying the universe, we're looking for the laws that this God would make, because it makes sense that he would put them there. Francis Bacon sort of invented the scientific method. And who doesn't love bacon? Galileo Galilei, one of the most misunderstood men in history. He did a lot for physics and astronomy. He used astronomy to create a case that showed that the Earth actually orbited around the sun. He did not prove that the Earth wasn't flat. Everybody already knew the Earth wasn't flat. All of Western culture has known the Earth was a ball. And the Bible says that the Lord hangs the ball of the earth on a thread of nothing. But what the Bible doesn't tell us is that the Earth orbits the sun. So Galileo realized that some of his observations made sense better in the model where the Earth and the planets were orbiting the sun, and the sun was kind of the representative center of the solar system. Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal was a great philosopher and a great theologian, but he also did a lot of work on barometric pressure, hydrostatics, that kind of thing. Mathematics. He did a lot. I think he invented the calculator and some kind of public transit system, like the public bus. Check out Pascal. He had an amazing life. Robert Boyle did great works in chemistry and gas dynamics, such that there is a law named after him. Nicholas Steno, still the foundation of stratigraphy and a lot of geology now is based on his work. Anton van Leeuwenhoek was the father of microbiology. He was one of the first people who not only built functional microscopes, but used them to observe and identify living things that were too small to see. And this was the beginning of modern cell theory and germ theory and modern medicine, that even through the 100, 200 years that followed, a lot of the connection between microbiology and disease wasn't understood. We didn't know anything about it before this, and as we started to discover microbes, one of the first things he studied was plaque. He scraped the plaque off of his teeth and saw bacteria, and he was like, "Oh, we little beasties on the junk in between my teeth." I don't think he was Scottish, but I don't know how to do his accent, so there you go. But we thought that diseases were caused by things like bad blood or bad air. So every time someone's all like, well, all of science seems to think that evolution's a fact, and are you smarter than all of science? I don't think it's likely that science is going to be wrong about this. I go, you ever studied the history of science? Because when George Washington got sick, an antibiotic would have cured him. What his doctors did to cure him, because modern medicine told them it was the right thing to do, is they cut him open and they bled out quite a bit of blood, because modern medicine, modern science said that, well, if somebody's sick, they have bad blood. You have to drain out the bad blood. And that probably is what killed him. But that's what modern science said. Let's go forward a little bit more. In the middle of the 1800s, Ignaz Semmelweis. I don't know how to spell it, but, good luck looking it up. Maybe Google. Just hit that microphone and say Ignaz Semmelweis. He was a European doctor who discovered that if he and his staff washed their hands, especially between doing cadaver studies on people who had died of a particular disease and then doing various other surgeries, that almost entirely eliminated the spread of disease from one patient to the other. And he said, look, there's something that we're carrying from an infected person physically carrying it to another person. And if we wash our hands, it washes off whatever is making them sick. And he said, look, I'm going to have all of my staff, and he recommended to other doctors and hospitals, have them wash their hands. It will cut down on disease and death because of the spread of disease. And we take that as common sense. But modern science, the scientists and doctors of his day mocked him and attacked him personally. And it would not be until seriously a century later that all hospitals made it as a part of a normal procedure to wash everybody's hands before doing hospital work. And so when people say to me, we're like, well, the majority of scientists today seem to think that evolution's a fact. And, I don't think science is going to be wrong. I go, you know what? 100 years ago, 200 years ago, the majority of modern scientists thought that it was stupid to think you had to wash your hands to not spread disease. They mocked this guy and said, despite his evidence, they decided he was an idiot. And yet today, we've all learned, oh, he was right. Looks like modern science can make a mistake if they're not open-minded to new ideas. So modern science today has been force-fed the doctrine of Darwinism since birth. And the teachers and the classes they took had been force-fed evolution since birth. We have had generations of people force-fed this, told it was science, with only the weakest possible evidence, as I will show you in upcoming episodes. And then the majority seem to believe, sure, yeah, but that doesn't mean they're right. It means that that's the culture they were born into. The majority of people in the Middle East are Muslims. Does that by de facto mean that Islam has to be true because that majority? No. They've been wrong in the past. They'll be wrong now. They'll be wrong in the future. The history of science is one where the majority are wrong. When Galileo said, hey, the earth goes around the sun, what did the majority of scientists think at that time? They thought, you're a nut. We've already decided the earth is at the center and the sun goes around us. So should he have said, oh, you know what? Who am I smarter than all other scientists? That's just arrogant. You guys are right. Clearly, you have to be. I mean, even as late as the last century, every modern discovery has been brought into a world where the majority of scientists thought something different. That's how science works. And so when people come to me and they're like, oh, that's how science just self-corrects. I'm going to show you that is not how evolution works. Evolution is not the result of science self-correcting. Evolution is the result of science being hijacked by atheists who, as I showed you with those former atheist quotes, it's hijacked by people who say, I'm going to start off with my assumption of atheism. I'm going to force that into everything so that I start off assuming materialism. I'm going to do science that only allows for materialistic explanations, and I'm going to make sure that design, intelligent design, the existence of God, any of that is absolutely not allowed as a conclusion of anything we do. Now let's do science. All right, here's an experiment, kids. I'm going to ask you a math question, but you're not allowed to say 4 as the answer. Ready? 2 plus 2. But you're not allowed to say 4, because if you do, you're fired. I mean, what are you going to get? You're going to get a whole lot of people who are like, well, I don't want to get fired. So a really small 5. There you go. Very small value of 5. All right, let me go through the rest of this list real quick. Isaac Newton, as you know, he made calculus because he wanted to explain the rotation of objects. He did some astronomy. He's the father of modern physics, but he wrote more about the Bible than he did about science. He considered himself to be a theologian, and we remember him as the father of physics. Michael Faraday studied electromagnetism. Again, one of the big names in science. Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur, in the middle of the 1800s, around the same time that Darwin was publishing Origin of Species, Louis Pasteur was proving the law of biogenesis, meaning that life only comes from existing life, which meant that he was using observational science to prove that the evolutionary story can't have a first chapter. There's no beginning to Darwin's story because it has been proven by science at the same time he was publishing it. Science, observable, testable, repeatable science, through Louis Pasteur, proved that his story had to be false because of what we could observe. And it's an established law of science that life only comes from existing life. And yet, in order to believe evolution, you have to reject that observable, testable, repeatable law. Louis Pasteur, you've probably heard pasteurization. It's how we kill off the germs in food so we can keep it on shelves for longer without killing ourselves. George Washington Carver was an inventor who invented hundreds of things, and ultimately his foundation was his faith in the Bible, that he believed that God gave us everything that we need, and in something as simple as a peanut, God would give us the ability to affect the world for good. And so that's one of the things he's known for, is inventing things, not exclusively peanut related, but that's what he's known for. And there's, of course, many, many others. There's the tip of the iceberg. The fathers of modern science were Bible believers. The clash is not between Christianity and science. Christianity gave birth to science. The fathers of every field of science were Bible-believing Christian men. Atheism is where the conflict comes in. Atheism hijacked science, and that's why there's a conflict now. Creation versus evolution is not the Bible versus science. It's a clash of worldviews. It is two different sets of starting beliefs being used to interpret the observable data. And they are not equal worldviews, as I will show you next time. So next time, we are going to talk about evolutionism. I'm going to get into detail about it. I'm going to explain what it is and how it works. And one of the things you're going to learn is that many people who think they believe evolution don't know how it works. It's not entirely their fault, but I'm going to get into the details of what it is, how it works, and you're going to see that it fails on its own merits, that science is enough to disprove evolution. So, thank you for joining me here today, kids. I appreciate you stopping by. I'm your friendly neighborhood Sin Hound. I'm going to leave you with a little bit of rock and roll and this reminder. Continue to tell the stories that bring life. Be excellent to each other. And party on, dudes. Yeah!